The desert stretched endlessly, an ocean of dust and silence under a merciless sun. Luke Dawson had ridden this route countless times before, searching for stray cattle or checking the fences that lined his lonely ranch. But that day felt different. The wind was hot and bitter, the kind that carried whispers instead of sound. His horse snorted uneasily, hooves sinking into cracked earth as the horizon shimmered. Luke squinted against the glare, the weight of solitude pressing on his chest, like it always did out here. He wasn't a man given to dreams or miracles, just hard work and harder memories. But sometimes the land hides what it wants to be found. As he rode along the dried creek bed, something caught his eye. Not movement, but color. A flash of brown against the pale sand. He slowed his horse and dismounted, every instinct sharp as the edge of his knife. What he found stopped him cold. A girl lay half-buried in the dust, wrists bound with coarse rope, her skin streaked with blood and dirt. Her dark hair clung to her face, tangled with feathers and sweat. She was breathing, but barely. For a long moment, he just stared, not sure if she was real or some spirit conjured by the desert's heat. Then she stirred, her cracked lips parting in a whisper he couldn't understand. He knelt beside her, his hand trembling as he pulled a canteen from his saddlebag. "Easy now," he said softly, lifting her head. She flinched at his touch, eyes wide with fear and fury. They were striking, sharp as obsidian, full of a strength that shouldn't have survived that kind of suffering. He poured a trickle of water to her lips, but she turned her face away. "He ain't here to hurt you," he murmured, voice rough with sand and sorrow. When she didn't resist again, he let her drink. Each swallow seemed to bring her a little further back from the edge of death. Once she could sit upright, Luke took his knife and cut the ropes that dug into her wrists. The sight of the raw marks made his stomach twist. Whoever had left her here had meant for her to die slowly. The girl's hands trembled, but she didn't thank him, only glared, eyes searching his face for deceit. He couldn't blame her. Trust was a thing long lost in this land. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture made her flinch again, but she didn't push it away. "You're safe now," he said quietly, though even he wasn't sure if it was true. She tried to stand but stumbled, her legs too weak to hold her. He caught her before she hit the ground, feeling her muscles tense in panic. "It's all right," he said, steadying her with care. She pushed at his chest, trying to fight, but her strength gave out almost immediately. He saw the stubbornness in her eyes, the same kind that lived in his own reflection, and knew she wouldn't surrender easily, not even to kindness. He helped her onto his horse, making sure she could lean against him without falling. Her breathing was shallow but steady now. He mounted behind her and turned toward the distant line of the hills. The ride back was slow. Every now and then she would mumble something in Apache, words he couldn't understand, but the tone carried pain, anger, and fear. He didn't speak. He knew silence sometimes said more. As the sky bled into shades of amber, Luke felt the old ache of loneliness stir again, but different this time. There was someone beside him now, a fragile spark of life he was suddenly responsible for. It terrified him more than any outlaw or storm. By the time they reached his cabin, night had settled like a blanket of shadows over the desert. Luke carried her inside and laid her gently on his bed, the only one he had. He lit a lantern, its warm glow softening the rough wooden walls. The girl's eyes followed him, still wary, still ready to flee. He boiled water, cleaned her wounds as best he could, and offered her a bit of bread. She took it hesitantly, hands shaking. The room was silent, except for the crackle of the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse but strong. "Why?" she asked, the single word laced with suspicion. Luke looked up from the fire. "Because no one else would," he said simply. She seemed to study him for a long time before lying back, exhaustion overtaking her. As her breathing slowed, Luke sat quietly, staring into the flames. He didn't know her name, her story, or why fate had brought her to him. But he knew this, that something in her eyes had burned through the emptiness he'd been carrying for years. Outside, the desert winds shifted, carrying with them the faint sound of coyotes. Inside, for the first time in a long while, the cabin didn't feel so empty. Luke leaned back in his chair, hat tilted low, and watched over her as she slept. The world beyond his walls was still cruel, still filled with men who would call her enemy. But for tonight, she was safe. And though he didn't understand it yet, saving her had already begun to save him too. The morning came sharp and clear, the kind that cuts through the bones of the desert. Luke Dawson woke before sunrise, as he always did, to the sound of horses stirring and the faint rustle of wind through the mesquite. The Apache girl, he still didn't know her name, was outside by the corral, feeding his horse with slow, careful movements. She had regained her strength over the last few days, but not her trust. She rarely spoke, though her silence no longer felt like defiance. It was survival. Luke didn't press her for words. He knew what it meant to carry ghosts too heavy for talk. He watched her from the porch, coffee steaming in his hand. There was something about her that unsettled him, not in fear, but in the way she reminded him that the world could still be cruel and beautiful at once. The bruises on her wrists had begun to fade, yet her eyes stayed watchful, always glancing toward the horizon, as if expecting danger. And maybe she was right to. In the Arizona territory, peace never lasted long. By midday, the first sign of trouble appeared in the form of dust on the horizon. Riders. Luke knew the look of men coming with purpose, and it wasn't the friendly kind. He set his coffee down and went inside to fetch his rifle. The girl saw the movement too and froze, her hands tightening on the fence rail. "Get inside," he told her, voice low but firm. She hesitated, then obeyed, slipping silently into the cabin. The riders came fast, 5 of them wearing the arrogance of men who thought the law bent in their favor. Their leader, a thick man with a red beard and a sheriff's badge hanging crooked on his chest, reined in his horse near the gate. "Morning, Dawson," he called, his tone casual but his eyes cold. "Word is, you got something that don't belong to you." Luke stood with his rifle across his chest. "Ain't got nothing here that ain't mine," he replied. The sheriff smirked. "We're not here for your cattle. We're here for the Apache girl. She's a runaway slave. Belongs to a trader down in Bisbee." The words made Luke's stomach twist. He didn't bother to hide his disgust. "You telling me a person can be owned now?" he asked. "That's what the law says," the man shot back, "and we're here to take her back." For a moment silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the creak of leather and the desert wind. Luke's hand tightened on the rifle. "She's no one's property," he said, voice low and steady. "You ride off now, and we'll forget you came." The men exchanged glances, some amused, others wary. "You gonna start a war over an Indian?" The sheriff sneered. Luke didn't answer. His stance said enough. The next moment happened fast. A glint of metal, the twitch of a hand, and the desert exploded in sound. Gunfire cracked through the still air, horses screamed, and dust filled the yard like smoke. Luke fired once, twice, hitting the man nearest the gate. Another bullet tore through his shoulder, but he didn't fall. He moved with grim precision, each shot an act of defiance of promise. The girl watched from the cabin doorway, heart pounding, torn between terror and awe. When the dust finally settled, 2 men lay dead, another groaned in the dirt, and the rest rode off cursing into the horizon. Luke leaned against the fence, blood seeping through his shirt, breathing hard but unbroken. The girl ran to him, dropping to her knees beside him. "You're hurt," she whispered, pressing a cloth to his wound. He managed a faint smile. "I've had worse," he said, though his vision swam. "They won't come back," she said, but he shook his head. "Maybe not. But others will." For a long time neither spoke. The desert around them was quiet again, as if the earth itself was catching its breath. Then she said something he didn't expect. "Why did you fight for me?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. Luke looked at her, really looked, at the strength in her jaw, the fierce light that still burned behind the hurt. "Because you deserve to be free," he said simply. She blinked, as if the words were something she'd never heard before, something too fragile to believe. That night, after bandaging his wound and cleaning the blood from the yard, they sat by the fire in silence. The flames cast long shadows across the cabin walls. She turned toward him, the firelight flickering in her eyes. "No one ever fought for me before," she said almost to herself. Luke didn't answer right away. He just looked into the flames and said, "You ain't alone anymore." Something in her broke then, not from pain, but from the sudden weight of being seen. She reached out, hesitated, then placed her hand lightly on his arm. For the first time since he'd found her, she didn't look afraid. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, carrying away the last echoes of gunfire. Days passed, and the land slowly healed along with them. She began helping around the ranch, tending to the horses, mending fences, learning the rhythm of his quiet life. Sometimes, when he'd catch her humming softly while feeding the animals, he'd feel that unfamiliar warmth again, the kind that comes from knowing you're needed. One evening, as the sun sank behind the red hills, she came to him with her hair braided, the feathers in it shining gold in the light. "I want to stay," she said. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she'd endured. Luke nodded once, unable to trust his voice. She smiled then, the first true smile he'd ever seen from her. From that day forward, they worked the land together. The ranch, once silent and empty, came alive again with laughter, the sound of two souls rebuilding what life had broken. People in town whispered about the rancher and his Apache wife, but Luke didn't care. The desert had taken everything from both of them once, but now it had given them something back. Under the endless Arizona sky, where freedom was as harsh as it was holy, two lost hearts had found home in each other. And for the first time, Luke Dawson no longer rode alone.